Welcome to the latest session of the Ideology and Aesthetics Research Network lecture series. I think apologies, we're running a little bit late today, and we have quite a number of people registered. However, they haven't quite joined us yet, so there may be people coming in later. Yes, I think we will begin the session now, I think. It's my very great pleasure to introduce you today. Sorry. My very good friend, my very old friend, Christos Asomatos, art historian based at the American College of Athens. Also my collaborator and co-author within the network itself, and also a forthcoming article on our concept of the ideological aesthetic, forthcoming through Angelaki in later this year, I think in September. So Christos is an art historian. His work focuses primarily on the relationship between ideology and aesthetics, and he focuses much of his attention on contemporary art. And the title of today's talk is Sovereignty and Antagonism in Contemporary Art. And without further ado, I will hand over to Christos.
Hello, everyone. Let me first share my screen so that we can start our discussion. All right, so as the title already says, I'm going to be talking about antagonism and sovereignty in contemporary art. I'm going to explain briefly what that stands for and signifies, and what are the problems that I'm going to be addressing in this talk. Firstly, to contextualize historically the discussion, I'm going to be generally referring to phenomena in contemporary art that can be generally summarized or described under the term the social turn. The social turn is a proliferation of socially engaged, relational and dialogical practices that has taken hold basically during the past 3 decades, from the 90s onwards. So those terms will become clearer along the way, but to start things off, this social turn has generally remapped the field of artistic discourse with the analysis of political categories now, often supplanting any other considerations. Within this process of reorientation emerges a new key distinction, which is going to be the problem I'm going to be discussing. This distinction relates to the problem between antagonism and affirmation in those socially engaged practices. By these two terms, antagonism and affirmation, or consensus, if we would prefer to use the term consensus instead, I'm referring to the type of relationships that the now social and often open-ended artwork seeks to cultivate within the expanded field of its production and its audience. This is, in fact, a debate that is particularly conspicuous in a number of occasions in recent decades. A few examples of this debate emerging would involve, for example, the debate between deliberative and dissensual politics in Documenta's 11 platform titled Democracy Unrealized. Other examples would include Grant Kester's critique of the rhetoric on artistic autonomy and self-determination in arts bodies since the 1970s, Maria Lind's critique of Thomas Hirschhorn's Bataille Monument of 2002, which was produced in the context of Documenta 11, as well as the aggressive back and forth between Claire Bishop and Grant Kester in the wake of the former's scathing critique launched with her article, The Social Turn, Collaboration and Its Discontents of 2006. As a starting point, and as a case study for today's talk, I'm going to be using one specific debate to keep things relatively concrete and specific. And this debate that I'm going to be using as a case study will be Claire Bishop's critique of relational aesthetics in Antagonism and Relational Aesthetics of 2004. Her text, which was published 2 years after the English translation of Nicolas Bourriaud's Relational Aesthetics, is a generally paradigmatic example equally of the problem of artistic and political antagonism, as well as of the broader socio-political term in art discourse, as Bishop frames her argument directly in the terms of antagonism and democracy in contemporary art practices. To make things a bit more concrete and easy to follow, therefore, I will also be using Santiago Sierra's work as the example, or rather as an example of the questions surrounding antagonism in contemporary art practice. Santiago Sierra has been elected here for a series of reasons. Firstly, Sierra is one of the artists that Bishop herself champions in her 2004 article. Secondly, Sierra's quite distinct artistic propositions schematize very efficiently the antagonistic dimension in art practice. And thirdly, using his rather, let's say, extreme example in order to draw more general conclusions, is in line with a direction of the discussion that I'm going to be presenting. As Walter Benjamin wrote in The Origin of German Tragic Drama in the mid-20s, the idea is best explained as the representation of the context in which the unique and extreme stands alongside its counterpart. Let's begin with the article by Claire Bishop. In this 2004 article, Bishop embarks on an attack against Nicolas Bourriaud and his proposition for a relational aesthetics. Bourriaud's advocacy for sociability and conviviality in contemporary art practice was contrasted by Bishop with a more morally ambiguous and conflictual interpretation of the social character of contemporary art. Bishop's polemic was not advanced simply as a disagreement on artistic matters or on artistic taste, but was addressing a key argument, political argument, that Bourriaud had put forward in his book, Relational Aesthetics of 1998. This key political argument was the attribution of a specific political and democratic character to his proposed art practices that fall under, that we can describe under the term relational art. While Bourriaud's conceptualization of democracy as represented through this art was enacted through negotiations, bonds, and coexistences, as he wrote, democracy, as counter-proposed by Claire Bishop, becomes possible as long as antagonistic social relations enter the artwork, and those antagonistic social relations make, according to Bishop, visible unacknowledged social exclusions. While the origins of the ideal of a simple and convivial contemporary democratic coexistence can be traced back to certain articulations of left-wing post-industrialism from the 1960s and 70s onwards, these ideas are probably less persuasive today. In terms of the artists enlisted in this debate, the debate between Bishop and Nicolas Bourriaud, Bishop drew a line between the ostensibly conciliatory character of the work of Rirkrit Tiravanisa and Liam Gillick, and the more antagonistic and authorial practices of artists such as Santiago Sierra, who I already mentioned, and Thomas Hirschhorn. This opposition became the point of departure for a rather political discussion, which highlighted the confrontation between two concepts of democracy: consensus versus antagonism, or vice versa, antagonism versus consensus. At this point, I would like to briefly introduce a few examples of the work of the aforementioned artists to concretize things, to make things a bit more palpable here. All right, so beginning with the side of artists that Bishop critiqued. Gillick works generally on a minimalist or post-minimalist tradition, which he uses to reproduce the visual language of the corporate world. And according to Bishop, this reinterpretation of the language, the visual language of the corporate world works in his installations as backdrops to human sociality. This is Bishop's take on Gillick. Gillick, we could argue, does not quite fit or encapsulate the idea that Bishop attacks in her essay, and has been generally dragged into this debate, seems at least to have been dragged in this debate because of Bourriaud's own interpretation of Gillick's work and his inclusion of Gillick's work in his theory of relational aesthetics. On the other hand, nevertheless, artists such as Rirkri Tiravaniza fit Bishop's polemic a bit more closely. Is in a way quite representative of what Bishop was aiming at in her article. Tiravaniza's signature works involve generally the transformation of the gallery space, of the space of art, into a space for free and convivial exchange. And very often, this free and convivial exchange is centered around, let's say, the unifying experience of culinary pleasure. An example of this is the Untitled Free, originally staged in 1992, but the artist has produced various versions of it in other artistic spaces, wherein Tiravaniza turned the space of the gallery into a makeshift, let's say, collective kitchen, wherein he was cooking Thai curry for his visitors. Let's move now to the side of the artists that Bishop champions as antagonistic and, in her opinion, therefore, more properly democratic. Thomas Hirschhorn has had a very, let's say, has produced a very rich, let's say, catalog of works, and I will not do him service simply attempting to summarize his works in a few lines. I will attempt, nevertheless, to give a very brief description of certain tendencies in his work. His work tends to be quite authorial and at the same time politically critical and alienating. These characteristics are juxtaposed with the fact that his work often involves the participation of a broader, let's say, community or a broader social and artistic audience. Hirschhorn is also not afraid generally of controversy, as his works, exhibitions in their highly critical and alienating capacity or function, often make use of non-professional photographs of destroyed bodies. So there is an element of like shock and antagonism in the inclusion of those rather, let's say, violent images. I'm going to give an example of this, like a shocking tendency in his work with a superficial engagement of 2006. I had to try really hard to include an image that was not very graphic from this show, but we can, I suppose, see traces of those destroyed bodies already in this image. Let's move now to Santiago Sierra, who's also going to be, as I have already said, the prime artistic source of examples in at least the first part of my analysis. Santiago Sierra is similar to Hirschhorn, again, not afraid of controversy. In works such as workers who cannot be paid, remunerated to remain inside carton boxes of 2000, he has restaged the work again. He employed 6 Chechen asylum seekers to stand inside carton boxes for 4 hours a day over 6 weeks. Because those asylum seekers were prohibited from seeking official legal employment due to their legal status, the workers were forced to remain in anonymity for their own safety. This premise is again explored a similar premise is explored in The Person Remunerated for a Period of 360 Consecutive Hours of 2000, again by the same artist, where Sierra employed someone to be hidden inside a gallery space in this rather like awkward, alienating, and we would say like dehumanizing position while an exhibition was taking place. Finally, in works in his 160 centimeters line tattooed on 4 people, the artist here seems to enforce the absolute surrender of the last remaining vestiges of autonomy of the people that he enlists to participate in the work. And these are people who apparently can no longer afford the illusion of choice. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this. In this work, 4 heroin-addicted sex workers were hired by Sierra for the price of 1 shot of heroin in exchange to sit while a tattoo was drawn on their backs. Sierra's generally expanded base of collaborators in his more socially oriented or socially engaged works magnifies humanity as being bereft of agency, humanity as being, let's say, bought and sold, and denied of even the most basic dignity. This is generally the focus that Bishop underlines, highlights in Sierra's work as he elects him to represent the antagonistic tendencies in contemporary art. After this brief introduction, let's return now to the actual debate at hand here. To outline the terms of political language, of the political language of antagonism that Bishop argued is essential for the production of critical democratic art, she relied on a specific theory. That theory is the theory of radical democracy, as this theory was articulated in the book Hegemony and Social Strategy that was written in 1985 by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. The writers, departing from an orthodox, let's say, Marxist analysis of class, advanced an interpretation of the social world loosely based on Antonio Gramsci's hegemony. This move away from traditional class analysis was a response to what the writers perceived as a pluralistic, fragmented, we could also say, world that could no longer be encompassed by categories which do not account for the centrality of difference in the post-war formation of political identity. In simple terms, for the writers, the heterogeneity of modern societies made traditional class analysis reductive and politically ineffective. In the theory of radical democracy, difference is equally the generative condition of political mobilization, as well as the basis of the pluralistic milieu that needs to be defended against right-wing neoliberalism. Laclau and Mouffe looked at social struggles as expressions of hegemonic articulations. That is, what they mean by hegemonic articulations is that what happens when a particular demand manages to lay claim to universality or a semblance of universality. Once this happens, certain blocks, social blocks, become politically mobilized, advancing therefore their own, let's say, hegemonic or counter-hegemonic image. As can be understood, these hegemonic articulations are always partial. There can be no one singular hegemonic articulation since there is social struggle and conflict. And as partial articulations, they're always in conflictual relationships with other articulations. This leads to the realization that the field of political power is structured antagonistically for Laclauan move, with antagonism operating both as the generative force of collective political identity, as well as the expression of an impossibility of general equivalence and reconciliation. So basically, antagonism mobilizes people in oppositional groups and at the same time underlines that there can be no lasting, let's say, social peace. The centrality that the writers accord to the concept of antagonism in their proposition of radical democracy, as is articulated in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, echoes clearly the prominence of the concept of antagonism in a rather, let's say, unlikely source, writer. This writer is Carl Schmitt. More specifically, the concept of antagonism as it is encountered in Carl Schmitt's political theory. It is worth noting that Hegemony and Social Strategy, the book, makes no direct reference to Schmitt by name. However, Schmitt's relevance becomes apparent, especially when we consider Chantal Mouffe's subsequent explicit engagement with him, which he has decided to describe as an attempt to think with Schmitt against Schmitt. This proposition will become clearer later on. Before we move to the discussion on antagonism, we can make a quick or a couple of quick preliminary observations on the debate between Bishop and Bourriot. Firstly, the opposition between Bourriot's relationality, conviviality, sociability, and so on, and Bishop's antagonistic practices is from the outset framed politically. Bishop does not so much politicize a disagreement on artistic matters or affairs, but rather contests Bourriot's political claims by way of art. There is therefore a quite interesting reversal here of the priority between artistic and political in artistic discourse. While Bourriot procures a vision of democracy grounded in the, as I said earlier, the imaginary of negotiations, bonds, and coexistences, Bishop advances a notion of democracy based on the constant and conflictual renegotiation of difference, inclusion and exclusion, that is. This is a case where the criteria for art are not simply explored outside, let's say, aesthetics, but the criteria for art, for artistic discourse, are also explored outside art's own field of reference or self-reference, which respectively characterized its aesthetic and post-aesthetic histories in modernity, in the modern era. What this debate clearly therefore illustrates is that the limits between the political and the artistic discourse or discourses are decidedly porous. Secondly, another preliminary observation that we can make. It is illustrative that the language of the debate between Bishop and Bourriot is firmly grounded in the symbolic space of, let's say, democratic language. Neither Bourriot nor Bishop projected their political claims beyond the level of a different signification of democratic social life and the ways that by which it can be constructed. What this entrenchment of critical language within the limits of democracy demonstrates is possibly democracy's seeming incontestability inside progressive, institutional, artistic, and political debates. Once this incontestability has been established, what remains to be determined is the exact configuration that is more adequate to democracy's alleged true meaning. This kind of circularity, because it is a certain circularity that we are encountering here, appears to basically affirm Stuart Hall's diagnosis of democracy's existence as a horizon, which signifies the idea of democracy that as having acquired such prominence that now appears to define the limits of discourse. Whether now this phenomenon is Fukuyamian, we could say, as in it represents or reproduces implicitly the assumption that the Western liberal democratic mode of social organization is also the final one, is up for discussion. And it is a discussion that might be quite interesting, but I'm not going to engage here. The main problem that Bishop identified in Rirkrit Tiravanidis and Gillick's open-endedness is, according to her, their uncritical exploration of the social relations they enable. To clarify, Bishop considers the unity, that is, the togetherness upon which the works of the two artists are premised, to be superseding any potential critical dimensions that socially engaged practices should foreground, according to her. Bishop argues that the generalized conciliatory character of relational art is by no means transformative of the conditions of social and political living. And in fact, this conciliatory character obscures the relations, let's say, of social tension. Social tensions, basically. In her analysis, the foundational premise of the work of Tiravanidis and Gillick is therefore the production of social synthesis, of consensus, that is. In doing so, Bishop argues, their work becomes the space wherein art and the outside world are presented to coexist in a harmonious balance. Bishop's objection is that social tensions, as I said, need to be acknowledged for democratic dialogue to exist. In short, for Bishop, the art of the two artists cannot lay claim to Bourriot's professed democratic qualities, as, according to her, it suppresses the dissent and conflict that permeate social relationships. Instead of that, Bishop argues or proposes a radical conception of contemporary democracy that can only be advanced insofar as the antagonistic dimension of social relations is sustained and highlighted. The concept of antagonism in Bishop's essay is, as I have already mentioned, taken from Laclau and Mouffe, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy of 1985. Bishop specifically quotes them in her article, writing, Laclau and Mouffe argue that a fully functioning democratic society is not one in which all antagonisms have disappeared, but one in which new political frontiers are constantly being drawn into debate. In other words, a democratic society is one in which the relations of conflict are sustained, not erased. Without antagonism, there is only the imposed consensus of authoritarian order, a total suppression of debate and discussion, which is inimical to democracy. Bishop's implication is therefore clear. While Bourriaud's model is likened to a vision of democracy based on amicability and consensus, there is a wholly different, let's say, conception of democracy, which reconfigures demographic politics on the basis of antagonism. Unlike, therefore, liberal theorizations of democratic life, radical democracy attempts to dispel the illusion that the multiplicity of positions in a pluralistic social landscape can be reconciled through recourse to a universal order of reason that is common to every member of a society. In opposition to the politics of reason and communication as mediators of social relationship, Laclau and Mouffe define radical democracy as the following, and here I quote them. Radical democracy is a form of politics which is founded not upon dogmatic postulation of any essence of the social, but on the contrary, on an affirmation of the contingency and ambiguity of every essence, and on the constitutive character of social division and antagonism. This is taken directly from Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. What is important in this formulation is that radical democracy is not conceived by the writers necessarily as a theory with specific political content, but as a theory of political form. The central element of this form, as we can also read, is antagonism. Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, therefore, defines radical democracy as the political form of antagonism, which ultimately leads us to Carl Schmitt, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. At this point, I will attempt to describe or summarize the utility of Carl Schmitt's political theory for Mouffe and Laclau in their conflictual theory of democracy by summarizing a few key propositions that he made. Now, Schmitt generally is a difficult writer to approach, not least because of his extremely troubling and odious association with the Nazi regime, an association that was relatively short-lived, lasted from 1933 to 1937, that has nevertheless, due to its gravity, contaminated his political theory. So it begs the question, therefore, how can we explain the resurgence of interest in Schmitt by a variety of left-wing, let's say, political thinkers? The answer, I'm going to attempt to provide it with this brief summary. So, firstly, in his masterwork, The Concept of the Political, whose most popular version was published in 1932, Schmitt proposed that every field of human action and thought is governed by a specific, powerful, and potent, pertinent distinction. Questions of morality are defined through the distinction between good and evil. Aesthetic problems are governed or defined through the distinction between beautiful and ugly. And the political problems are governed through the distinction or by the distinction between friend and enemy. In one of his most famous articulations of this, let's say, distinctive organization of human thought and action, Schmitt wrote, "The specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy." This is, as I said, a very, very famous aphorism. Political life, therefore, for Schmitt, comprises instances of conflict that follow the necessary politicization of groups of people into groups of friends and enemies. And every political concept consequently, acquires its meaning through a specific struggle, through reference to a specific struggle, because it is with reference to a specific struggle that groups of people split into friends and enemies. Smith also writes in the concept of the political is the most intense and extreme antagonism, and every concrete antagonism becomes much more political the closer it approaches the most extreme point, which is that of the friend and enemy grouping. This summarizes, therefore, or rather highlights the conflictual and distinctive character of the political, as well as the extreme signification that Smith grants to the idea of the political. It is the most intense and extreme antagonism. So it's not like an everyday conflict or an everyday contradiction. It has a specific polemical and grave content. After all, in his political theory, the culmination of political antithesis is war. So the end game of the political is war, generally. Another key contribution of the writer is the implication that what is political is not defined as a specific sphere with substantial characteristics, which are separate from the rest of the spheres of human activity. It, in fact, constitutes the field of antagonism and antithesis, be they cultural, religious, or economic, once the polarization they create is strong enough to divide groups of people into relationships of friendship and enmity. This friend and enemy distinction is superior to every other possible one, and once its generative antagonism reaches the levels of intensity that are necessary for its formation, it takes over all original former disagreements and politicizes them. Smith has described this property, let's say, of the political, its ability to supersede, to overshadow all original disagreements, but when they become political, as the following: the real friend and enemy grouping is existentially so strong and decisive that the non-political antithesis, at precisely the moment at which it becomes political, pushes aside and subordinates its hitherto purely religious, purely economic, purely cultural criteria and motives to the conditions and conclusions of the political situation at hand. If a relationship, therefore, can be political, it is antagonistic, and this relationship becomes political as soon as the antagonism that shapes it reaches an intensity strong enough to divide people into friends and enemies. This is a summarization of his friend and enemy, of the relevance of the friend and enemy grouping to the political and the powerfully existential character of political distinctions. Another key lesson or contribution or proposition that Smith proposes in his political theory is that he actually provides a particularly incisive critique of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, as a generally synthesizing political order, is founded on the assumption of the existence of unifying values that can be arrived at through consensus. The consensual legitimation of liberal democracy entails, according to Smith, subduing political enmity into economic competition and intellectual or ideological conflict into rational debate and deliberation. This makes liberal democracy, always, according to Smith, as he also argued in the age of neutralizations and depoliticizations of 1929, it makes liberal democracy into the space of depoliticization par excellence, since liberal democracy basically attempts to present political, hence contingent and antagonistic decisions with a veneer of neutrality and objectivity. Now, the problem with liberal democracy when it attempts to present this veneer of objectivity and naturalness is that in order to accomplish that, it is necessary for liberal democratic orders, according to Carl Schmitt, to enlist abstract and universal values, concepts. For example, the idea of progress, equality, humanity, and so forth. These ideas are, however, again, according to Schmitt, neither neutral nor universal, and their representation as such, their representation as such in liberal democracy ends up paradoxically theologizing oppositions. This means that the liberal depoliticized state wages war on the basis of absolute categories in the name of humanity, progress, peace, etc. Once those ideals of an abstract humanity are deployed in a conflict, Schmitt argues, the combatants are completely deprived of their actual humanity. They become enemies, not in the sense of political enemies, but enemies of humanity. As Schmitt wrote, when an outlaw of humanity is essentialized, war can be driven to the most extreme inhumanity. This naturalization or tendency towards naturalizing an essential humanity as diagnosed by Schmitt in liberal democracy comes with terrifying consequences. Actual political battle, on the other hand, according to Schmitt, is not based on this denial of humanity, on hatred, or on the wish of total annihilation. Schmitt says that one can have an enemy who is still the other, the stranger, someone existentially different and alien, without this other or this relation devolving into utter dehumanization. It is therefore important to understand that in Schmitt's political theory, liberalism's depoliticizing tendencies can escalate conflict into unprecedented levels of violence. We can, from this small exposition, we can understand that one of the objectives of Schmitt's political theory is to desacralize conflict, to make conflict, to take conflict from the level of the abstract, the universal, and perhaps even the sacred, into the level of the specific, and by extension, the limited. Therefore, to turn conflict into battles connected to specific and concrete antagonisms, rather than conflicts between the bearers of certain universalized ideals and those who are believed to not be, let's say, participants in those universalized human ideals. This latter sacred, let's say, type of conflict produces deterritorialized and profoundly asymmetrical conflicts for Schmitt. And he gives also in his writings a few examples of this. For example, he argues that the history of European colonialism was premised exactly on this, on the universalization of reason as essential, reason, progress, and so on, as essential to an ideal of humanity that the Western world projected to the entire world, and therefore when Westerners confronted people and nations and cultures who did not hold this ideal, they were treated as less than human. This analysis comes from a later book, a geopolitical book of his, titled The Nomos of the Earth, which he wrote in 1950. Another example, more contemporary example of this sacred, abstract, and universal conflict we can understand would be the war on terror, which happened recently, relatively, like during the past 20 years, wherein specific nations and specific political and military organizations were not waging war against other state or political entities, but they were waging war against this abstract idea of terror. Because terror is abstract, it can be universal, and therefore potentially everyone could become an enemy. And an enemy who embodies or represents the idea of terror is an enemy who will not be treated fairly in war. Now, this is also something that Giorgio Agamben, who is like a commentator on Smith's work, has extensively written on. Let's return to Laclau and Mouffe, therefore. What they draw in hegemony and socialist strategy from Smith's antagonistic interpretation of political life is the ability of antagonism to mobilize and reveal actual political and not essentialized conflicts, not abstract or universal conflicts. The longer political identity is allowed to be constructed on abstractions with universalist pretensions, the likelier it becomes that these will be actively expropriated from an enemy. And the longer political processes are masqueraded as final, anodyne, or consensual, the closer we get to their universal and unconditional enforcement. This is a lesson that this is generally an idea that Laclau and Mouffe obviously engage with, that can be seen to originate in Smith's critique of liberal democracy. These are, in summary, the ideas that Claire Bishop also evokes in her criticism of relational aesthetics. Bishop argues that unlike Tiravanisa and Gillick, Sierra and Hirschhorn allow the artwork or the art event, the artistic event, to acquire antagonistic characteristics, to acknowledge the exclusionary constitution of social formations and the impossibility of their final, rational, and consensual reconciliation. The forms, on the contrary, of dialogue that Sierra and Hirschhorn facilitate do not collapse, according to Bishop, these relationships into the work's content, but are marked by sensations of unease and discomfort rather than belonging. Furthermore, Hirschhorn's and Sierra's incorporation of the actual labor of disenfranchised economic and social classes challenges, according to Bishop, contemporary arts, self-perception as a domain that also embraces other social and political structures. There is, however, a peculiarity in Smith's theory of the political that generally complicates its utilization in different contexts, such as the context of art that we are discussing. And this peculiarity needs to be addressed generally. The peculiarity lies in the fact that in Smith's classification of the political and its attendant distinctions between friend and enemy, Smith makes sure to disentangle political enmity from private, intersubjective, and affective relationships. So therefore, political enmity for Smith is separate from the private, intersubjective, and affective world. The political enemy emerges, according to Smith, when two collectivities confront each other and is by definition, therefore, public. Political enmity is a public enmity. This is a crucial point because Smith, by doing so, denies the private or domestic enemy of any political character. This is also important because the political character of things in Smith's theory is a legitimating character. Political equals legitimate in a way in Smith's theory. So now with a private, intersubjective or affective, let's say, enemy being a non-political enemy, this non-political enemy is clearly delegitimized in Smith's theory, in his political theory. His system, therefore, Smith's system, is characterized by a certain resistance to account for enmity between the state or interstate level. And as we can understand, this resistance makes it slightly inflexible as a system when we attempt to use it in more microscopic and intersubjective contexts. Benjamin Arditi and Jeremy Valentine, who have dealt with this resistance on the part of Smith, have proposed in their book titled Polemicization, the Contingency of the Commonplace, written in 1999, that Smith's decision to restrict political enmity to the state and interstate level reflects basically Smith's own ideological commitments to a conservative tradition which theorizes political order as the exclusion of internal divisions. Alongside this conservatism of Smith, who attempts to produce the image of a political order that is not interrupted by internal strife, we also have a certain romantic attitude on the part of Smith, a certain romantic outlook on war, to be more specific, as the domain of clear and distinct political entities. It has to be noted, nevertheless, that the distinction that Smith draws between the public, state, and therefore political enemy, and the private, internal, and therefore non-political enemy is a highly contentious point of his theory, and it is a point that has been challenged by several theorists that have engaged with his work, including, for example, even Jacques Derrida in his Politics of Friendship. Derrida's Politics of Friendship is obviously a very, very interesting text, but I'm not going to be engaging with it now. Smith draws or legitimizes this political distinction between the public and the private enemy from a series, from several sources, which are both historical as well as philological. Although it escapes the purview of today's talk or the scope of my discussion here, I will simply list a couple of those sources to also give you a better idea about the validity or the legitimacy of the division between public, therefore political, private, therefore non-political in Smith. One source was actually Plato's own distinction between wars that happen between Greeks and foreigners and Greek civil wars. This distinction is found in the 5th volume of the Republic, of Plato's Republic, around verse 470. The distinction that Plato articulates between external wars involving Greeks and foreigners and civil wars produces, according to Plato, two different political situations. The first situation is polemos, war, which is interpreted by Smith as actual political war. And the second situation is called stasis in Plato, which Smith resignifies as civil unrest, as factional oppositions, and so on. Another source for Smith's distinction is the semantic distinction between the Latin words hostis and inimicus, which in turn Smith associates with the ancient Greek words polemios and echthros. Hostis is polemios, according to Smith. Inimicus is echthros, according to Smith. This distinction between hostis and inimicus is drawn from Egidio Forcellinis, 18th century Totius Latinitatis lexicon that Smith references in the edition of 1932 in the concept of the political. As we generally understand, Smith's decision to contain the political in the public or state sphere, in the public or the sphere of the state, is generally a prescriptive and rather moralizing distinction that cannot really hold under scrutiny. Plato, for example, we know that the Republic was written in the wake of the absolutely devastating Peloponnesian War, and it would make sense that he would pathologize civil war in this book. And as opposed to civil war, he would attempt to treat war between Greeks and foreigners as generally something natural. On the other hand, and as David Lloyd Dusenberry has demonstrated, the second distinction between the distinction that is between hostis and inimicus is actually not so stable even in the source that Smith cites, which is Forcellinis' lexicon. Dusenberry has actually shown, by going back to the first editions of this lexicon, that that hostis, or that inimicus rather, is both polemios and echthros in the dictionary. So Smith, in a kind of like convenient manner, attempts to overlook the fact that inimicus, which he describes as the private, non-political enemy, is described by Forcellini himself both as political and non-political enemy. Nevertheless, and aside this, outside this pedantry, basically, even Smith himself was not particularly confident in the distinction between the private and the public that he attempted to draw. For example, and I quote from the concept of the political itself, Smith writes, if domestic conflicts among political parties have become the sole political difference, the most extreme degree of internal political tension is thereby reached, i.e. the domestic, not the foreign, friend and enemy groupings are decisive for armed conflict. This passage is quite important because Smith implies that in conditions wherein a state or polity cannot determine a grand public enemy, as is implied by his hypothesis on domestic conflicts becoming the sole political difference, enmity turns inwards. This has also been picked up as an idiosyncratic element in Smith's analysis, and he calls this phenomenon, Derrida calls this phenomenon hyperpoliticization, and he describes it critically as the political over-determination of the interpersonal in the absence of the exterior constitutive enemy. By extension, if societies hold the perception that the struggles over the large issues have been settled, and I'm using Francis Fukuyama here, a formulation from the end of history, the political importance of the sphere of interpersonal relating inevitably emerges exaggerated, not least because spaces of public politics become walled off pretty much. To return now to our discussion on art, this inwardness of political considerations is successfully illustrated in, firstly, the thematic prominence of intersubjectivity in Bourriaud's relational art, as well, and secondly, in the term that Bourriaud himself employs to describe the character of his artists' political interventions. The term that he uses to describe this character is micro-utopian, as opposed to modernist utopianism. This micro, therefore, signifies a turn inwards into the micropolitical and the microscopic. In a way, therefore, Bishop's argument in favor of the politics of artists such as Santiago Sierra expresses a specific political impulse that is regularly suppressed in contemporary societies. To the extent that Sierra dissociates the moral or political judgment of his artistic process from the substantive, moral, and political reality underlying it, his work becomes a protest against the more, let's say, processual politics of intersubjectivity. We could even argue that his work even carries a distinctly anti-prefigurative character, in the sense that the processes and the relations that it is founded on and reproduces, are precisely those relations that foreclose political liberation. And these relations that foreclose political liberation are contractual brutality, sexual humiliation, the spectacularization of capitalist heteronomy, and so on, which are all characteristics of the works that we briefly looked at when we discussed Santiago Sierra. So far, I have looked at antagonism as a political tool that can critically pierce through the veneer of objectivity, naturalness, and consensus. However, as was already apparent in Smith's own formulation, antagonism as the power that drives politicization also carries a constitutive function. This is an issue that remains relatively muddy in Smith's own writing. Firstly, the division into groups of friends and enemies cannot be completely arbitrary, but as we can logically infer, needs to be grounded, at least partially, in some pre-existing and therefore pre-political characteristics. So people do not randomly become friends and enemies or split into groups. There are certain pre-political characteristics that increase the likelihood that they will form specific groups. To address this problem, which is not really explored in the concept of the political, Smith introduces a rather troubling term in his later writing, beginning, for example, with the state movement people, the triadic structure of the political unity of 1933. This term that he introduces is the idea of Artgleichheit in German, which is not translated, cannot be translated precisely in English, but would basically mean something like sameness of kind, as we can understand, a term that can be easily racialized and has been racialized. On the other hand, as antagonism can divide people into the friend and enemy groups, it inevitably articulates a new relation wherein the parts which engage now in this new relation behave in radical different ways. This tension, therefore, between a prior identity that is mobilized by antagonism and antagonism as generative of new identities has also concerned Laclau and Mouffe. Laclau and Mouffe attempt to address this problem by distinguishing antagonism from the categories of logical contradiction and real opposition. The former occurs when one of the terms of a proposition affirms something another term denies, and the latter, real opposition, happens with the interaction of objects that already have their own individual, let's say, positivity before their relation. For example, a case of a real opposition would be the collision of material objects, therefore that are materially positive, full and complete before their collision. In the case of logical contradiction, it is something that we generally encounter in our everyday life very, very often. We all hold various contradictory beliefs, but they do not necessarily, actually they rarely, if ever, produce antagonism, those contradictory beliefs that we harbor. The problem of conflating antagonism with real opposition, on the other hand, is that it would basically reduce a complicated social phenomenon such as antagonism into the relationships and interactions of objects between things, therefore, that follow, follow physical laws, natural laws. Laclau and Mouffe, in fact, give a very illustrative here example of the conflation between real opposition and antagonism by creating the image of conflating the idea, the concept of class struggle with the gesture of a policeman hitting a worker. This is, according to them, what it would mean to associate antagonism with real opposition. Antagonism, therefore, according to the writers, needs to be defined separately from logical contradiction and real opposition. A key commonality between logical contradiction and real opposition is that they describe, according to the writers, oppositional relationships whose parts are fully constituted before they enter this relation. In the case of logical contradiction, it cannot even be understood as such without the defined meaning of the contradictory terms, while in a real opposition, objects, as I said, interact following the laws of nature generally. Based on this realization, the writers, Laclau and Mouffe, conclude that antagonism should therefore describes relations whose parts are not fully constituted prior to their relation. Does that, however, imply that the originally not fully constituted part of an antagonistic relation become fully constituted once this relationship has been established? The answer for Laclau and Mouffe is no. In fact, hegemony and social strategy theorizes that their antagonistic relation, once it takes hold, impedes, obstructs the complete formation of the identity or the identities of the antagonistic parts. I quote here. But in the case of antagonism, we are confronted with a different situation. The presence of the other prevents me from being totally myself. The relation arises not from full totalities, but from the impossibility of their constitution. So, antagonism can indeed have an articulating effect for Laclau and Mouffe. That is, it can form, therefore, new identities for the parties of an antagonistic relation. After all, Laclau and Mouffe advocacy of left-wing populism takes that as a given, that there can exist a construction of the demos through politics, but the identities that are produced in an antagonistic relation are not complete or permanent. They are instead contingent and relational, according to Laclau and Mouffe. Laclau and Mouffe therefore exhibit a generalized resistance to objectivity. And this resistance to objectivity facilitates or accommodates their own emphasis on the defense of contemporary social heterogeneity. After all, the reification of specific, complete, and stable identities as a result of concrete struggles would ultimately eliminate social heterogeneity. But this resistance to objectivity is also consistent with their conception of antagonism as a contingent and constant force in the social. This constancy of antagonism in the social for Laclau and Mouffe signifies, ironically, a departure from Smith's own theory and the gravity that Smith's theory accords to antagonism. For Smith, antagonism, as I said also earlier, fully reveals its potency in the ability to mobilize social groups for the event of real physical violence, with war being its ultimate manifestation. Because of this possibility of real physical violence, and by extension war, Smith attempts to posit antagonism to be contained in a way within a strong political order. After all, the production of this strong political order has consistently been the objective of Smith's political theory. Furthermore, the totalizing characteristics of Smith's concept of the political, which is dependent on the production of enemies, something further contaminated by his own involvement with the Nazis, always presents the possibility for the conflation of political decision with the production of an absolute external other. The radical, the otherizing potentiality of Smith's friend and enemy distinction is, as we can guess, hardly compatible with the theory of radical democracy that seeks to preserve heterogeneity. This led both writers, Laclau and Mouffe, to a reconsideration of their terms and their advocacy. For example, Laclau, in his essay titled Glimpsing the Future of 2004, uses the notion of inclusive exclusion as the social relation produced by antagonism, arguing that both sides of the antagonistic relation are necessary in order to create a single space of representation. Mouffe has also followed a similar course. Since 1993, with the publication of her The Return of the Political, she has revised the original formulation of antagonistic radical democracy in favor of an agonistic pluralist democracy. The concept of antagonism has not been abandoned altogether in her writing. It is still central, but is now understood not as an inevitability that needs to be cultivated, but as an inevitability that needs to be sublimated in a way in political life. Antagonism is therefore not something to be harnessed for the liberalization of democracy, but is now something closer, approximates more closely the reasons behind Smith's anti-liberalism, in the sense that liberalism suppresses the conflictual nature of the political, and by doing so, it enlists abstract ideas of reason and consensus. The democratic paradox of 2000, again by Chantal Mouffe, provides a useful summary of Mouffe's reorientation to this agonistic approach. Mouffe distinguishes between two types of political opposition, antagonism and agonism. Whereas antagonism is constituted by the confrontation of enemies, agonism describes the oppositional relation of adversaries. Agonism and adversary, therefore, represent sublimations of antagonism and enemy, respectively. Unlike antagonism, agonism presupposes the existence of a common symbolic ground wherein a conflict plays out, and unlike the enemy, the adversary, in Mouffe's theory, shares the ethico-political principles of liberal democracy, which are liberty and equality. Mouffe's revised democratic theory attempts then to rescue liberal democracy from itself by dislodging it from its consensual, deliberative ideologies. As antagonism cannot be eliminated and the possibility of the friend-enemy group is always present, Mouffe's more agonistic approach aims to create the condition that make antagonism less likely to materialize in the production of radical external others, which, as I said earlier, is a problem that she diagnoses in Smith. With a sublimation of antagonism into agonism, contends that we can construct them in such a way that is no longer perceived as an enemy to be destroyed, but as an adversary, that is somebody whose ideas we combat, but whose right to defend those ideas we do not put into question. To accomplish that, antagonism needs to be acknowledged, and any attempt to at its suppression leads to its intensification. Universalist illusions need to be therefore abandoned, as there is no indivisible public sphere, and every social configuration is inevitably hegemonic. Democratic politics needs to instead engage in the production of hegemonic configurations, which nevertheless remain open to democratic critique and contestation. In Mouffe's attempt to think, as he describes it, with Smith against Smith, the objective of democratic politics becomes the transformation of the frontiers of exclusion that every political configuration inevitably establishes into porous, contestable limits that are continuously subject to progressive change on the horizon of the greater, let's say, inclusion of difference. Now, whether this is something that is not already integrated in Western-type liberal democracy is up for discussion. I'm not going to engage with that problem, but it is something, it is a common critique of against Mouffe's agonistic turn. To return to the question of art, to the original debate, if we apply this agonistic analysis to the work of Santiago Sierra, Bishop's argument becomes clearer. The artist foregrounds the exploitative and dehumanizing conditions that his participants are subject to, because a democratic polity needs to acknowledge and conflictually renegotiate its exclusions. Mouffe, therefore, parallel to her to the adoption of agonistic pluralism in the place of antagonistic democracy, presents a rather granular, processual, and we could even say reformist model of human action and by extension history. This is obviously, this processual understanding of human action and history is at odds with Smith's reliance on a more eventual understanding of history, with rupture, suspension, and exception constituting main and powerful operating forces in the social for Smith. As he wrote in his Political Theology of 1922, after all, precisely a philosophy of concrete life must not withdraw from the exception and the extreme case, but must be interested in it to the highest degree. The exception can be more important to it than the rule, not because of a romantic irony for the paradox, but because the seriousness of an insight goes deeper than the clear generalizations inferred from what ordinarily repeats itself. The exception is more interesting than the rule. The rule proves nothing. The exception proves everything. It confirms not only the rule, but also its existence, which derives only from the exception. The rule, that is normality for Smith, is therefore constituted by the exception, by the exceptional and the extreme. What we perceive as a norm originates in a specific rupture, a specific suspension of the order of things that furnishes a new order of things. If we apply this insight that the reality of concrete life derives from the singularly extreme and the exceptional, rather than the general and the continuous, to the problem of Santiago Sierra's magnification of exclusion, as that is embodied in the dehumanizing relations his objectified collaborators are subjected to, the denial of the humanity of those participants, which is their exceptional situation, reveals itself as the foundation of our norms. If the exception is the source of the norm therefore has to reflect the exception or has to accommodate, facilitate the exception. From the Smithian, therefore, perspective, we can say that the exception which produces Sierra's objectification is not an anomaly that can be treated or corrected, amended, rectified. The exception is the moment that reveals the true order of things and is not an unpleasant reminder of its secondary, rectifiable, or dispensable characteristics. The exception is, in fact, for Smith, the very basis of sovereignty, of the sovereignty of the state. This is, of course, condensed in one of his most famous formulations on the topic in political theology. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. For Smith, without this sovereign power to create exception, there is no possibility for the survival of a political community. The moment that the state surrenders this power and thus forfeits its ability to produce exception through establishing a new order is also the moment that the state is faced with its imminent collapse, because now it has become an order that lacks the mechanisms, the instruments that would allow it to defend itself against existential threats. Smith, we could argue, is generally a philosopher of suspicion. The breakdown of the order of things is the order of things. If, therefore, it is the nation state that has produced the exception in Sierra's objectified participants, then this is the nature, this is the real face of the nation state. If it is democracy that it is responsible, then this is the nature of democracy. No matter how open or radical it becomes, it will always produce its excluded and thus banish them beyond the frontiers of its protection. This is something that Agamben understood well in his own analysis of sovereignty when he elected the camp, the concentration camp, as the hidden paradigm of the political space of modernity. The nomos of the modern for Agamben is not the consequence of an illiberal or an undialectical formulation of the state, but fundamentally a problem of sovereignty that has only been accelerated in the modern era with humanity's inscription into a legal entity. This is also why Slavoj Žižek, in his Welcome to the Desert of the Real, has insisted that enlisting Agamben in a radical democratic project that seeks to renegotiate or redefine the limits of in and exclusion borders on a misappropriation of his ideas. This means that a state of exception is the emergence of a new order transcending the norm that seeks to fend off and eliminate certain threats insofar as these threats are considered existential. I quote from Smith: "The state suspends the law in the exception on the basis of its right of self-preservation, as one says. The state of exception reveals, therefore, a certain duplicity as a concept. On the one hand, it suspends order as soon as it is understood to have been pervaded or dominated by indirect powers that threaten it, with an ultimate view of protecting this order. And in that case, it ultimately returns to a non-exceptional state. So there is a double character. It suspends order to preserve it so that it can return back to it after the threat has been eliminated or driven away. This is at least Smith's own definition or theory on the state of exception. This means that the state of the exception negates certain norms and rules in order to create a specific new order of life and guarantee that order. Once the concrete situation that called for the creation of the exceptional new order is removed, so must the state of exception, according to Smith. Now, whether that is done or not is a completely different topic. I mean, whether the state of exception, in fact, retreats or is a more permanent, let's say, feature of political sovereignty. At this stage, and with the structure of exception and sovereignty as articulated by Smith in mind, we are forced to wonder generally, isn't the systematic structure of the space of the art exhibition or the event, regardless of its content, akin to that state of exception, as Smith describes it? Isn't the intervention, the decision of the artist, an instance of transformation of the former symbolically public space of art? Does not the artist's enclosure of the space signify the emergence of a certain specific new order? Furthermore, isn't the space of possibility within that order distinct from that of the norm, of normality, with a new framework emerging that at the same time enables the new artistic order of the event and safeguards its existence? And finally, are we not ultimately designed to return to a non-exceptional state once this is all over? Boris Groys has recognized this similarity between the Smithian state of exception and the event, the installation of art. After all the art that we have been discussing so far falls under the category of the installation. Groys points out in Installing Communism, the visitor is on foreign ground, an expatriate who must submit to a foreign law, the law laid down by the artist. The artist is not only sovereign, but also legislator of the installation space, even or maybe specifically, especially if the law given by the artist to the community is a democratic one. So therefore, the relations that the artist of the installation or of the event creates to the audience is the relation, according to Groys, between the sovereign and the people who must submit to the new exceptional situation that the sovereign brings forward, initiates. The author of the installation space is therefore paralleling the exceptional event in the creation of a new order, the laws of which the public are required to submit to. The artist, it must be noted, does not belong to the community constituted by the new order he or she authors, the artist. The order that shapes the community of the art space is created from without. This confusion is particularly prominent nowadays because, as Groys intelligently points out, it is not uncommon for the contemporary artist to join the public that they have shaped after the establishment of this new public. The cultural expectation that the sovereign artist becomes a part of the community that they shape obscures generally the sovereigntist, the original sovereigntist character of the artistic gesture, which in turn we can understand that mirrors in a way the general tendency in liberal societies towards obfuscating, obscuring sovereignty at large. What this highlights is that if the antagonistic artist performs the impulse towards sovereignty, which is suppressed in the diminution of the political and liberal cultures, then the political becoming, which is realized in this sovereign act, should not be explored in the dehumanized, excluded participants in Sierra's installations, but it should be explored in the audience of contemporary art itself, because it is the audience that submits to this new order initiated by the artist. It is therefore not the subject suffering under the absolute heteronomy of the antagonistic artist that are realized, it is us, basically, it is the contemporary art audience. The objectified collaborators are never realized in these installations. Yet this raises a crucial question that needs to be addressed. What is the form of this political becoming of the contemporary art audience, of the art event, of the artistic event? As Grant Kester correctly identifies, to argue for the antagonistic artists revealing of antagonism, conflict, and drudgery as gestures transformative of political subjectivity implies that there is a contemporary art audience for which all these conditions are still concealed. This sounds a bit like an oxymoron, considering who the contemporary audience for art are comprised by. This conceptualization of this ideologically blind contemporary art audience is in reality closer to a type of art audience of Philistines from the, let's say, the late 19th or early 20th century, compared to the audience of contemporary art. Or as Kester further suggests, this assumption is premised of the ideologically blind contemporary audience is premised on the universalization of a naive and ill-informed viewer, that is, an imaginary viewer who needs to be disrupted and disabused of ideological blindness and insensitivity through art. A viewer who is, ironically, I might add, largely not a member of the audience of contemporary art. On the contrary, in the spaces of contemporary art, the spaces of contemporary art tend to primarily attract these educational and professional classes whose certainties need to be disrupted the least. Despite art's formal and thematic societalization, the primary audience of a performance or installation remains an initiated one. Aside from the discussion now on the structure of the art event and its affinities with a performance of sovereignty on the part of the artist, it would also be worthwhile to consider the form and the content of the antagonistic work of art, which form and content also extend to the relations produced by a work of art. Firstly, as long as the antagonistic act unfolds within the art space, it is entirely dependent on the specific context that signifies it as an artistic and political experience. The publics most likely to accept it as a legitimate proposition through attending, engaging, and discussing it are those who are already sympathetic to its underlying ideas. For these publics, the forms of relations that the work produces are those that construct a symbolic space for the experience and performance of certain sentiments, ideas, such as, for example, shock, outrage, sympathy, and so on. These sentiments and ideas, which are, let's say, facilitated within the art event, primarily affirm the pre-existing belief system rather than antagonizing it. Once the dimension, therefore, of this imaginary, ill-informed, and ideologically blind, reactionary, and backward art public is removed from the picture, what is revealed is that the work's function in reality presupposes the existence of a common ideological ground among the people it addresses. As we can understand from the case of Sierra also, antagonistic works premised on revealing the unacknowledged public acceptance of exception can be recognized as such, insofar as a significant part of the public sphere is still structured in a way that can recognize that state of events as perverse. The work, therefore, becomes possible as a critique of the contemporary distribution of sovereignty only due to the existence of a generalized agreement on how its exclusions are or should be negotiated. This, of course, makes us wonder how truly antagonistic is all that. So, and this is the final part of my talk here, what happens when this common symbolic ground between artist and public, this prior identity between the two parts that grants the former their sovereignty and the latter the perception of political becoming is absent or contested? What happens when this parameter of exclusivity that safeguards the art event and the relations between artist and audience is removed? I'm going to briefly explore these two problems by looking at two recent contemporary art case studies. Interpol of 1996, which was organized by the Swedish Jan Aman and Russian Viktor Misciano, was an international exhibition that sought to bring together art from Western and Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War. Positioned centrally in the main hall of the Fabriken in Stockholm was Gu Wenda's installation, United Nations, Sweden and Russia Monument. The work, consisting of hair-knitted seeds collected from Swedish and Russian barbershops, a rocket from the Swedish Air Force, and the flag of the European Union, attempted to emblematize the exhibition's spirit of international connectedness and unification. Even though Wenda's installation was presented as a collaborative project, in reality, it was not so. And in fact, the image that it presents does not take into account the political differences between the former Soviet Union and the West. It generally subsumes everything under the universalism of the liberal West. So, partly motivated by personal, let's say, antipathy and anger, but mostly due to this imperialist conceit, pretension in Wenda's work, the Russian artists Oleg Kulik and Alexander Brenner decided to actually, who were participants in this collective show, decided to disrupt the exhibition. There was a brawl that took place with Kulik ended up getting arrested, and after engaging like in fights with the audience as well as with Jan Aman, one of the two curators, while Brenner at the same time also destroyed the installation. This is an image of the destroyed installation that we're looking at. This incident was also recognized by the two opposing factions as a political incident rather than be understood in the genealogy of artistic iconoclasm and so on. So, for example, Gu Wenda, who was the artist whose work was destroyed, attributed the actions of the Russian artists, Brenner and Kulik, to their nationalist and communist ideologies, that the latter of which he even associated with Nazism. Wenda. On the other hand, Brenner argued that this was a radical democratic, let's say, expression against neoliberalism. So the events of Interpol underline the often rhetorical nature of critical invocations of antagonism in art practice, while they showcase that an artwork collapses under forces properly antagonistic and not agonistic. Forces, therefore, which do not correspond to a shared ideological framework, as we saw in the case of Brenner, Kulik, and Wenda. The second case study is Thomas Hirschhorn's Deleuze Monument of 2000. This case study underlines the contingency of artistic sovereignty upon the ability to enforce the artist's law, which mirrors in a way the exception, according to Smith, as the bringer of order, not of chaos. Hirschhorn's large-scale public monuments dedicated to important intellectual figures are among his most general characteristic works. There is a series of works beginning with the Spinoza Monument, moving on to the Deleuze Monument in Avignon that we're looking at now, the Gramsci Monument, and so on. It is therefore like a concept that Hirschhorn has explored in a variety of sites and occasions. The monuments as Hirschhorn conceives them, are living socio-political and cultural sites within generally urban environments, hosting performances, discussions, screenings, and various other social and educational, as well as entertaining activities for the local and general public. Despite the apparent social, open, and collaborative character of this project, Hirschhorn is adamant about the centrality, about the importance of his presence and his authorial identity in the materialization of those works, as well as in the protection of those works. He has in fact formalized this system of ideas, a system of principles, into what he describes presence and production. And I quickly read from a quote from 2009, "My presence, the artist's presence that is, and my production, the artist's productions that is, first of all." These are the two most important aspects of his work, his presence and his production. Because that's the condition that makes participation possible for the inhabitants. Therefore, participation is not the aim of my work. Participation can only be a consequence of my presence and my production. This is a highly, let's say, sovereigntist and authorial declaration of intent behind his work. Hirschhorn, in the specific case of the Deleuze monument, conceived it for the citywide exhibition La Beauté, curated by Zander Loissy. Defying the suggestions of the curator, Hirschhorn decided to construct the project outside Avignon's walled historical city center and move the work to the city's suburbs, the banlieues, so that it could actually face the social reality of the city as a work of art. The first option was Cité Louis Gros, which had to eventually be abandoned because the actual local population felt that bringing this work there would exacerbate issues of criminality in the neighborhood. So it was moved to, or it was constructed, erected in Cité Saint-Fleury, a neighborhood that was similarly plagued by poverty and violence. 2 months, nevertheless, after the opening of La Beauté, and 2 months before it was originally scheduled to end, Hirschhorn decided to prematurely abandon the work, to cease the work, to stop it. There are 2 events which led to this and sealed its premature death. Firstly, he had to deal with the theft of video players that they had installed for the screening, educational, and social activities of the public that he was attempting to construct around the Deleuze monument. This was the first event. The second event that happened a couple of days later was the art critic Hervé Laurent with his partner, while they were heading to this monument, were brutalized, were mugged and beaten up in the street by possibly, I would imagine, like a petty criminal of the general vicinity, in the general vicinity in the neighborhood of the Deleuze monument. Hirschhorn, interestingly, attributed both those events, both the vandalism and theft, as well as the beating up of the art curator, of the art critic, apologies, to his personal inability to be continuously physically present in Avignon, which was true. He was not present during the entirety of the days of the work, and he attributed those, let's say, crimes and those incidents to his absence, to his inability, therefore, to enforce, let's say, his sovereign presence in a way. Notwithstanding now the rather symbolic character of his proposition, it also signifies something quite important to consider about the nature of artistic control and the impossibility of the artwork to exist in its absence. The truth is that by moving outside the geographical and cultural space, and therefore addressing constituencies outside those that socioculturally comprise the audiences for contemporary art, the artwork is exposed to the possibility of heteronomous forces. And these are heteronomous forces against which it cannot survive. So despite all the pretenses about creating works of art that can face social reality, as soon as those works of art exit, let's say, the legal order of the artist and institution, the schematic and metaphorical legal order that they institute, the work falls prey to the world of heteronomy and violence, which is a violence that it cannot counteract, it cannot survive. Artworks, therefore, and this is where I'm closing, can exist only by virtue of a system of belief that artists and public partake in. When this system is disruptive, works, no matter their social conceits, fall apart. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Christos, for a very extensive and interesting talk. So if you missed the introduction to our talk, we kind of had to begin rather quickly, so we never had to give much context for the talk itself and for the wider network, etc. So my name is Udith Dematagoda. I'm an assistant professor at Waseda University in Tokyo, and I'm the chair of the Ideology and Aesthetics Research Network. So we will just end this session with a couple of, a brief discussion of some of the points raised in Christos's talk. So I'm just going to, as usual, use my chair's privilege to ask the first question. So Christos, I think that the picture you paint is a very interesting one and a very perturbing one as well to some extent. I think that you kind of illustrate very well this situation which has been emergent since the 1990s, since arguably the fall of the Soviet Union, etc., in which the artist has been pushed into the role of the political theorist. And I guess that contemporary art, with a great deal of enthusiasm to some extent, has taken on this this kind of role of political theory, not very particularly effectively in some cases, but enthusiastically nonetheless. So I think that, do you think that this encroachment of contemporary art on the space of political theory, as the field of political theory itself has become itself more kind of fixated upon legitimacy through quantitative methods, etc., statistics, etc. The sphere of contemporary art has kind of taken up this kind of field of political theory. Do you think this encroachment is a kind of general phenomenon, and it is a welcome phenomenon? That's
that's a very good question. Generally, because there is a lot of the contemporary, let's say, art world remains relatively multipolar. It's not so centralized. So it is a bit difficult to answer comprehensively, yet that this is the new law of things from now on. But absolutely rightly, as you identified, there is a quest and a problem of legitimacy in a lot of contemporary art, and this legitimacy seeks to be derived by engaging with social and political categories instead of, let's say, the more introspective and self-referential discussions on art's own system of signs, reference, and symbols. So there is a quest of an attempt to derive some legitimacy through the politicization of contemporary art. And there are a lot of artists and arts bodies that are very happy to engage with that, because it is an attempt to carve out a social role in the midst of, let's say, funding cuts and so on. After all, ironically, Clement Greenberg many decades ago argued that the birth of modernism, at least artistic modernism as he understood it, was a fear by modern artists, on the part of modern artists, that what they're doing will be reduced to the level of entertainment or to even religion in a largely irreligious nowadays society, that art by itself, unless it seeks a specific, unique role, will become, let's say, completely secondary, dispensable, and so on. So there is therefore like a problem there and a question there, and a certain stress and anxiety there on the part of many artists and art bodies. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting insight, of course. Now, perhaps to kind of get you to discuss a little bit more about that particular point. So I know, as I mentioned, artists and art institutions enthusiastically have taken up this role as a kind of proxy political theorists, etc. But is it really a political theory that has any efficacy, I guess, in disrupting any sort of kind of notion of, I don't know.
No, I know what you mean, but does political theory have any efficacy beyond art? Like we are sometimes we might be asking too many things from art.
Sure. Okay, so just to kind of like maybe go back to your discussion of Carl Schmitt and his kind of notion of liberal democracy as a state of depoliticization par excellence. And there's the problem, I guess, of the veneer of objectivity within liberalism, which also relates to what we're talking about in the previous question, I guess. So, the invocation of universal concepts, equality, human rights, progress, peace, etc. These are abstract concepts, as Schmitt acknowledged. And his kind of stated aim in his kind of project, largely speaking, was to kind of desacralize the conflict, the political sphere to some extent. And to make it something which is concerned, as you said, with concrete propositions, etc., instead of this kind of discourse on competing political theologies. I hope that's a kind of accurate discussion. Yeah. So what I'm curious about, and I know your kind of view on this, but I think it might be quite useful context for the audience, etc. Isn't there something psychologically seductive within this kind of idea of liberalism itself, which is obviously seductive when you acknowledge that it is the hegemonic system, right? So what I mean by that, there's a certain kind of psychopathology, I guess, in this kind of cognitive dissonance, vis-a-vis the kind of inherent hypocrisy the hypocritic attitude one has to take towards a great many things within, for example, in contemporary American politics, which at the moment is in this kind of struggle to make a proper distinction between its competing kind of democratic camps, etc., right, which are increasingly revealed to have no distinction between them whatsoever. So this is this kind of notion, the psychologically seductive idea of the political ideology, not as false consciousness per se, but as cognitive dissonance. What I'm wondering is, there is a reason why it's seductive, I guess, and it's a reason why people buy into it, and this kind of might reveal something about your discussion a little bit more. I wonder if you have any more insight.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be particularly original. Schmitt himself argues that, let's say, there is indeed the psychological component, and in the, let's say, the hegemonic capacities or potentiality of liberalism, and it is the very human and humane avoidance of conflict and the fear of conflict. So it makes sense, because Schmitt theorizes that liberalism emerges in the wake of a series of like extremely destructive religious wars, and represents and embodies and expresses a certain attempt to distance oneself from the conditions of violent conflict. So yeah, there is indeed something seductive on it. And even like in contemporary, like in our everyday, the idea that there is that the large issues have been settled and we don't need to fight with one another or kill each other over some, let's say, questions is a consoling one.
Okay, interesting. So it's primarily, I guess, a kind of consoling and sort of palliative sort of notion. I guess, yeah, okay. That I think that's a very good point to sort of end this lecture at this point. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
If you would like to, and thank you very much to Christos for an incredibly interesting and engaging lecture. The video for this lecture will be posted on our YouTube channel, the Ideology and Aesthetics Research Network, which you can search on YouTube. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It will also be on our website, which you could join, through which you could join our mailing list, which will have on which we'll post details of our forthcoming lectures and events, etc. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much to Christos.